She gave him everything. A home filled with love, her unyielding faith, and a hope for redemption that never wavered. Evelyn Harper, known to her community as Big Mama, had already endured more loss than most could bear. The tragic death of her only child and her son-in-law in a car accident left her reeling, but also left her with a purpose: to raise their son Jamal as her own. She became his rock, his refuge, and his guiding light. But sometimes, even the brightest lights can falter in the shadows of pain and regret. But one fateful night, the unthinkable happened. The boy she had nurtured, protected, and loved became the architect of her deepest sorrow. A quiet house, the stillness of midnight, and a betrayal so devastating it defies comprehension. How does a bond, forged in love, unravel so completely? How does a life of unwavering sacrifice lead to a night of unimaginable violence? What could drive a grandson to commit such a heinous act against the woman who gave him everything? Was Jamal Harper a victim of his circumstances, a life shaped by grief and trauma? Or did choices made in anger and recklessness sealed both their fates long before that night? This is not just a story of crime. It's a story of broken trust, shattered dreams, and the devastating ripple effects of unhealed wounds. Tonight, we unravel the haunting mystery behind Jamal and Big Mama, a case that stunned a community and left a family irreparably scarred. How did love turn to heartbreak and heartbreak into tragedy? Stay with us as we journey into a story of faith-tested, choices ignored, and consequences that would change their lives forever. In a quiet neighborhood, where life moved at a slow, steady rhythm, Evelyn Harper, affectionately known as Big Mama, was more than just a resident. She was a cornerstone. Her modest home, with its neatly tended garden and weathered porch, was a sanctuary for those who knew her. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, cooked enough for a crowd even when she dined alone, and always had a warm smile for the strangers she passed on her way to church. To many, Big Mama embodied grace and resilience, a woman who had weathered life's storms with unshakable faith and dignity. But even the strongest hearts can be broken. And for Big Mama, that break came not from a stranger, but from within her own home. Evelyn's life had not been without hardship. She had already endured one of life's cruelest blows, the loss of her only daughter Clara and her son-in-law Andre in a devastating car accident. One rainy evening, a slick highway claimed their lives in an instant, leaving behind a void that seemed impossible to fill. But in the wreckage of that tragedy, there remained a single, fragile connection to the family she had lost. Her grandson, Jamal. 14 years old, orphaned and grieving, Jamal became Evelyn's entire world. She took him in without hesitation, embracing the role of mother once more, even as her own grief threatened to overwhelm her. Raising him wasn't just a duty, it was an act of love, a way to honor the memory of her daughter and son-in-law. In the years that followed, Evelyn gave Jamal everything she had to offer: her time, her wisdom, her unrelenting care. She worked long hours as a housekeeper to provide for him, sacrificed her own comfort to make sure he had what he needed, and prayed for him every night, lighting candles at church and asking for guidance as she tried to mend the pieces of their shattered lives. To the outside world, she was a hero, a woman who, despite her age, had stepped into an overwhelming role with unmatched determination and grace. Neighbors spoke of her with admiration. She was the kindest soul I'd ever met, one recalled. She'd take the shirt off her back for anyone in need. To think Jamal would, The voice trails off, unable to articulate the unthinkable. But behind the closed doors of that modest home, the cracks began to show. The bond between grandmother and grandson, once so tender and close, started to strain under the weight of unspoken grief, unanswered questions, and unhealed wounds. Jamal, the boy who once laughed at her stories and helped her in the garden, began to change. His sorrow turned to anger, his confusion to defiance. As he grew older, the responsibilities Evelyn had so willingly embraced began heavier, the sacrifices greater. And yet, despite the challenges, she pressed on, determined to save him from a world that seemed intent on taking everything she held dear. No one could have imagined that the same boy she had worked so tirelessly to protect, the boy who was her last connection to her beloved Clara, would one day be the source of her greatest sorrow. The betrayal that unfolded within the walls of her home was not just a crime. It was a fracture of trust so profound that it left an entire community in shock. How could this happen? What went so wrong in the life of Jamal Harper that he would turn on the very woman who had saved him? To answer these questions, we must first step back and piece together the story of their lives. A story of love, loss, and the devastating cost of choices left unspoken. On the outskirts of a small, unassuming town lay a neighborhood that seemed to embody the word ordinary. Modest homes lined the streets, each with its own patch of neatly trimmed lawn and a mailbox that had probably stood in the same spot for decades. The rhythm of life here was quiet, predictable, porch lights flickering on at dusk, children riding bicycles until their mothers called them in for dinner, and church bells chiming faithfully on Sunday mornings. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged waves across driveways, and no one ever thought to lock their doors before bed. In the heart of this neighborhood, tucked behind a garden of hydrangeas and roses that bloomed defiantly against the seasons, stood the home of Evelyn Harper, Big Mama to those who knew her best. The house was modest, its paint weathered by time, but it radiated a warmth that set it apart. A white rocking chair rested on the porch, often accompanied by a crocheted blanket thrown across the back. Inside, the home was a testament to a life built on love, faith, and resilience. Family photos adorned the walls, their faded edges telling stories of better days. Days when her daughter Clara's laughter echoed through the halls, and her grandson Jamal's playful mischief brought life to the rooms. Evelyn had lived in that house for nearly 3 decades, a widow for most of them. Her husband's passing had left her with a quiet strength and an unshakable faith in God, both of which she carried into every aspect of her life. She was the kind of woman who could make a stranger feel like family, offering a warm smile or a comforting word to anyone who crossed her path. To the outside world, Big Mama's life seemed simple, perhaps even idyllic, but inside those walls, she carried the weight of loss heavier than most could bear. In her later years, the loss of her daughter Clara and son-in-law Andre in a car accident turned her world upside down. In an instant, their young son Jamal became her responsibility, thrusting her back into the role of a parent at an age when she had hoped to slow down and savor the twilight of her life. But Evelyn didn't hesitate. She took Jamal into her home and into her heart, pouring all the love and strength she had left into raising him. To her, he wasn't just a reminder of the family she had lost. He was a second chance to protect the legacy Clara had left behind. In those early days, Jamal was a boy full of life, with an infectious smile and boundless curiosity. Neighbors recalled seeing him race his bicycle up and down the street or kneel beside Big Mama in the garden, his small hands digging into the soil as she taught him how to plant tomatoes and flowers. He was polite, well-mannered, and a source of pride for Evelyn, who never missed a chance to talk about her grandson's latest accomplishments at school or in church. Despite the tragedy of losing his parents, Jamal seemed to flourish under his grandmother's care. But grief is a quiet force, often lurking beneath the surface until it can no longer be contained. As Jamal entered adolescence, the cheerful boy he had once been began to fade. The loss of his parents, compounded by the challenges of navigating teenage years without them, weighed heavily on him. By the time he turned 14, the cracks in his spirit had begun to show. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, his laughter replaced by a sullen silence. Evelyn, ever the nurturer, tried to fill the void with faith and love. She took him to church, helped with his school work, and reminded him constantly of the values his parents had instilled in him. But as the years passed, Jamal's grief hardened into something darker: anger, defiance, and a restlessness that drove him away from the woman who had sacrificed so much for him. By the time he reached adulthood, the transformation was stark. Gone was the boy who had once clung to his grandmother's hand during storms, replaced by a young man whose nights were spent in the company of strangers, with alcohol and substances dulling the pain he refused to confront. His recklessness knew no bounds, and the warmth of Big Mama's home, once his sanctuary, became a place he avoided, his visits growing increasingly rare and tension-filled. It was a cruel twist of fate. How a life that began with such promise could spiral into chaos so quickly. For Evelyn, the hardest part wasn't Jamal's behavior itself, but the memories of the boy he used to be. She clung to those memories, hoping against hope that she could find a way to reach him, to remind him of the love and faith that had once defined their bond. But Jamal seemed lost, drifting further with every passing year, until one night, his pain and anger boiled over in a way that would shatter their lives forever. This quiet neighborhood, with its hydrangeas and rocking chairs, would never be the same. The house that had once been a beacon of love and resilience became the site of a betrayal so profound that it sent shockwaves through the community. To understand how such a tragedy unfolded, we must first step into the lives of Jamal and Big Mama, peeling back the layers of their story to uncover the pain, the choices, and the unhealed wounds that led to an unthinkable night. It was a night that began like so many others in the Harper home. A quiet house, the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the living room, and Evelyn Harper, known to everyone as Big Mama, seated at her small kitchen table, hands clasped in prayer. She prayed every evening for her grandson Jamal, as she had done for years, hoping that the boy she had raised with love and sacrifice might find his way back to the values she had tried so hard to instill. That night, the streets outside were unusually still, a heavy silence hanging in the air like a warning of something about to break. Inside the house, however, all was calm, except for the weight of worry that Evelyn carried. She had stayed up late again, waiting for Jamal to return, though she knew he wouldn't come home at a reasonable hour. It was a pattern she had grown heartbreakingly accustomed to. 11:07 p.m. The distant hum of an engine broke the silence as Jamal's car turned onto their street, the tires crunching on the gravel driveway. Evelyn lifted her head at the sound, her heart sinking. She recognized the erratic rhythm of the engine's idle, a sign that he'd been drinking again. When the front door creaked open, the smell of alcohol and smoke hit her immediately. Jamal stumbled in, his footsteps heavy and uneven. He barely glanced in her direction as he tossed his keys onto the table with a careless clatter, the sound sharp in the stillness. Evelyn, seated across the room, watched him with a mixture of concern and sorrow. "Jamal," she called softly, her voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." 12:30 a.m. Jamal paused, swaying slightly as he turned to face her. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements erratic. "Not now, Grandma," he muttered, waving her off. But Evelyn was resolute. She rose from her chair, her small frame dwarfed by his towering presence. Yet her determination was unmistakable. "I've stayed silent for too long," she began, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "You're destroying yourself, Jamal. This can't go on. I love you, but I can't keep watching you throw your life away." 12:10 a.m. Her words seemed to ignite something in Jamal, a spark of anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. He laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of humor. "You don't understand anything," he snapped, his voice rising. "You think your prayers and your rules are going to fix me? You don't know what it's like to lose everything." Evelyn stood her ground, though the pain in her eyes was evident. "I lost everything too, Jamal," she said quietly. "Your mama and daddy, they were my world. But I didn't let that pain destroy me. And I won't let it destroy you either." 12:24 a.m. The argument escalated, Jamal's frustration boiling over. He paced the room like a caged animal, his gestures wild, his voice loud enough to rattle the windows. Evelyn, though visibly shaken, remained composed, her voice calm but unwavering. "If you can't find it in yourself to change," she said finally, her voice breaking, "then you can't stay here. I love you, Jamal, but I can't watch you do this to yourself anymore." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For a moment the room was silent except for the sound of Jamal's ragged breathing. Then, without warning, he stormed out of the kitchen, his footsteps pounding down the hallway. 2:34 a.m. The house had fallen back into uneasy quiet, the kind of stillness that feels heavy with unspoken tension. Evelyn had returned to her room, exhausted but restless. She sat on the edge of her bed, whispering a final prayer before attempting to sleep. The creak of her bedroom door interrupted the silence. Her eyes snapped open, and she turned to see Jamal standing in the doorway. His face was shadowed in the dim light, but the anger and confusion in his eyes were unmistakable. "Why would you say that to me?" he slurred, his voice wavering between desperation and rage. "Jamal," Evelyn said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady, "go back to bed. We'll talk in the morning." But Jamal didn't move. Instead, he stepped into the room, his movements unsteady, his presence menacing. 2:37 a.m. What happened next shattered the fragile peace of the Harper home. In an instant, the tension that had been building for years erupted into violence. Evelyn, frail and unprepared, tried to resist, her hands trembling as she pushed against him. She pleaded with him to stop, her voice breaking, but her strength was no match for his. The room seemed to close in around them, the air heavy with the weight of an unspeakable act. When it was over, Jamal slumped to the floor, his head in his hands, the enormity of what he had done slowly dawning on him. Evelyn lay motionless, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling with shock and disbelief. The next morning, the sun rose over a house forever changed. Jamal, now sober, was consumed by the weight of his actions. He fell to his knees before his grandmother, begging for forgiveness. But for Evelyn, there were no words. The pain, both physical and emotional, was too much to bear. She looked at the boy she had raised, the boy she had loved unconditionally, and saw only a stranger. The events of that night would send ripples through their lives, through their community, and through the very fabric of what remained of their family. What could drive a man to betray the person who had sacrificed everything for him? And what happens when love is tested beyond breaking? These are the questions that linger in the wake of that fateful night, questions that have no easy answers. When the call came into the station that morning, it seemed like any other report, an incident at a quiet suburban home. But as the details began to unfold, the gravity of the situation became clear. This wasn't a routine domestic dispute. It was something far more shocking, something that would leave even seasoned investigators grappling with disbelief. The first officers on the scene were met with an atmosphere of palpable tension. The modest Harper home, which had always been a picture of tranquility, was now a crime scene. Inside, they found Evelyn Harper, known affectionately to her neighbors as Big Mama, visibly shaken, her face pale, her hands trembling as she recounted the events of the night before. Sitting in stunned silence was Jamal Harper, her grandson, the accused. Detective James Carter, a veteran of the force with over 2 decades of experience, arrived shortly thereafter. Known for his calm demeanor and meticulous approach, Laura was not easily rattled. But as he walked through the home, taking in the remnants of a night that had shattered a family, even he felt the weight of what had occurred. We've seen our share of cases, but this one? It hit differently, Laura later admitted. It's not every day that you walk into a scene where the suspect and the victim share a bond as close as grandmother and grandson. It was hard to process. His partner, Detective Laura Martinez, echoed the sentiment. You think you've seen it all, but then something like this happens, and it just stays with you. Martinez had been with the department for 8 years, and though she had worked numerous cases involving family violence, the particulars of this one struck a nerve. As they began their investigation, the first step was to document the evidence. The house itself held subtle but telling clues: a room in disarray, signs of a struggle, and items out of place. Evelyn, though deeply shaken, cooperated with investigators, recounting the events in painstaking detail. Her voice trembled as she described the confrontation with Jamal, the escalation of his anger, and the horrifying assault that followed. The team quickly secured a statement from Evelyn, but her words alone were only part of the picture. The detectives knew they needed concrete evidence to support the case. Medical professionals who examined Evelyn confirmed physical injuries consistent with her account. The medical report, though clinical in its detail, painted a vivid and harrowing picture of the violence she had endured. Forensic technicians combed through the scene with precision. Samples were collected, fingerprints documented, and any trace evidence that could corroborate Evelyn's account was carefully catalogued. The forensic results left little doubt. The evidence matched her testimony, leaving a trail that directly implicated Jamal in the crime. While the evidence painted a clear picture, investigators needed to hear from Jamal himself. In the interrogation room, under the stark fluorescent lights, Jamal sat hunched over, his head in his hands. He was visibly distressed, but his words, when they came, offered little in the way of accountability. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I wasn't thinking straight. I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing." His confession, while damning, was riddled with excuses. Jamal seemed intent on shifting the blame to his circumstances, to his emotional state, to the substances he had consumed that night. He spoke of the anger he felt, the frustration that had built up over years of unprocessed grief, and the sense of failure that had consumed him. But as he spoke, it became clear to the detectives that his words were an attempt to deflect responsibility rather than confront the reality of his actions. "I've lost my parents, you know," he added, his voice tinged with bitterness. "It's been hard, really hard. Nobody understands what that's like," Detective Laura later reflected on the interview. He kept circling back to his own pain, as though it excused what he'd done. It was frustrating, because while we could acknowledge his struggles, there was no justification for what he put his grandmother through. As the investigation progressed, a pattern began to emerge, one that pointed to a history of recklessness and self-destruction. Jamal's background revealed a troubling trajectory. In his teenage years, he had been a promising student, but the loss of his parents had marked a turning point. By his late teens, his behavior had dropped erratic. He had dropped out of school, drifted between jobs, and fallen in with a crowd that encouraged his worst tendencies. His struggle with substance abuse was well documented. Police records showed multiple instances of public intoxication and minor drug offenses. Friends and acquaintances, interviewed by detectives, described him as a young man consumed by anger and sadness, someone who sought temporary solace in substances that only deepened his troubles. One acquaintance described him bluntly: "Jamal was the kind of guy who'd drink to forget, and then end up causing trouble. It was like he was trying to numb himself, but it never worked." For Evelyn, this behavior had been a source of constant worry. She had spent countless nights praying for Jamal, hoping that he would find his way back to the boy he had once been. But those prayers had gone unanswered, and the young man Jamal had become was a far cry from the grandson she had cherished. The investigation brought into focus a tragic reality. Jamal's actions were not the result of a single moment of anger, but the culmination of years of unresolved pain, poor decisions, and a lifestyle that had spiraled out of control. For the detectives, the challenge was not only to piece together the events of that fateful night, but to understand the context that had led to such a devastating outcome. As they prepared their case, Laura and Martinez worked tirelessly to ensure that Evelyn's voice would be heard, that her suffering would not be overshadowed by Jamal's excuses. The evidence was clear, the confession undeniable, and yet the emotional weight of the case lingered, a reminder that, even in the pursuit of justice, there are no true winners in a story so steeped in tragedy. At first, the tragedy inside the Harper home seemed unfathomable. The whispers began almost immediately, among neighbors and in the small police precinct tasked with unraveling what had happened. Initial reports suggested something many in the community had assumed. Perhaps it was a break-in, a crime committed by an outsider who had taken advantage of the quiet neighborhood's vulnerability. After all, who could imagine such violence within the walls of a family home? Rumors of a home invasion spread quickly, fueled by the chaos of that first morning. The scene at the Harper residence, marked by disarray, seemed to align with the possibility of an external threat. A kitchen chair overturned, drawers left ajar, and the frantic state of Evelyn Harper herself, shaken and barely able to speak, added to the confusion. Detective James Carter, however, was cautious. Something about the scene felt off, as though the story was incomplete. While there were signs of a struggle, there was no indication of forced entry, no shattered window, no broken lock, nothing to suggest an intruder had made their way in. And then there was Jamal, silent, somber, and seated at the edge of the living room when officers arrived. His presence was puzzling, yet no one wanted to jump to conclusions without evidence. But as investigators dug deeper, the truth began to take shape. Fingerprints, physical evidence, and the chilling confession from Jamal himself eliminated any doubt. There had been no home invasion. The violence that had shaken Evelyn's home had come not from an outsider, but from the person she had spent her life trying to save. Jamal Harper was not just a witness. He was the perpetrator. The investigation took a darker turn with Jamal's admission during questioning. It began with his excuses, the blame he cast on his circumstances, his anger, and his substance abuse. But then, Jamal revealed something that added another layer of devastation to an already harrowing story. He was HIV positive. Jamal confessed that he had been diagnosed months earlier, but had done little to address it. He described a life spiraling out of control, a cycle of reckless relationships, substance use, and emotional numbness. His admission was not just a reflection of his carelessness, but a stark indicator of how far he had fallen. For Detective Laura Martinez, the revelation struck a personal chord. When he said it, you could tell he didn't grasp the gravity of what he was admitting, not just for himself, but for his grandmother. It was like the weight of his actions hadn't fully hit him. When news of Jamal's condition reached the small community, it was met with disbelief. People who had once regarded him as a promising young man now struggled to reconcile that image with the person he had become. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. In the weeks following the incident, Evelyn began to experience symptoms that she could no longer ignore: fatigue, persistent aches, and an unshakable sense of weakness. Reluctantly, she visited the doctor, accompanied by Jamal, who had been released on bond but remained under scrutiny. What followed was a diagnosis that would leave her reeling. Evelyn was HIV positive. The medical team explained the likely cause, and the link was undeniable. The betrayal she had suffered was now compounded by a lingering, physical reminder of Jamal's reckless choices. It was like being struck by lightning twice, a neighbor would later remark. First, what he did to her, and then, to learn this? It's unimaginable. For Evelyn, the diagnosis was a crushing blow, but it wasn't the only burden she carried. She now faced a decision that no grandmother should ever have to make. Despite the unimaginable pain Jamal had caused her, there was still a part of her that saw the boy she had raised, the boy she had loved, unconditionally. But the weight of what had happened, the assault, the violation, the diagnosis, was too much to bear. Evelyn knew she had a responsibility, not just to herself, but to the justice system, and, in some way, to Jamal. She knew that by allowing him to remain free, she was enabling the very behavior that had destroyed their family. In a moment of quiet resolve, Evelyn picked up the phone and called the authorities. Her voice was steady, though laced with sorrow, as she explained her decision. "I didn't want to call," she admitted later. "But what he did, it left me no choice." Detective Laura, who took her statement, described the moment as one of the most difficult of his career. You could see the heartbreak in her eyes, but also this strength. She wasn't just doing it for herself, she was doing it because she knew it was the only way to stop the spiral he was in. As word of Evelyn's decision spread, the community was left grappling with the layers of betrayal. People who had admired Jamal as a child and respected Evelyn as a pillar of strength now found themselves questioning how such a tragedy could unfold in a family that had already endured so much. For Evelyn, the days that followed were a blur of emotion. Grief for the grandson she had lost long before that fateful night. anger at the choices that had led them here, and a lingering hope that perhaps, through accountability, Jamal might one day find a path to redemption. The Harper home, once a place of warmth and love, now stood as a symbol of fractured trust. Its quiet walls bore witness to secrets that had unraveled a family, leaving behind questions that no answer could truly resolve. This case wasn't just about a crime, it was about the collision of love and betrayal, responsibility and despair. It asked questions that no one wanted to face. How far should forgiveness stretch? At what point does accountability take precedence? And how does a family move forward when its foundation has been irrevocably broken? These are the questions we'll continue to explore as we uncover the impact of this tragedy on everyone it touched. The road to uncovering the full scope of what happened that night was as harrowing as the crime itself. For investigators, the case was both straightforward and deeply unsettling. There was no question of who had committed the crime, but understanding the why required delving into a life unraveling under the weight of trauma, poor choices, and reckless behavior. It began with the evidence, a trail of facts that pieced together a narrative too devastating to ignore. From the very beginning, medical reports left no room for doubt. Evelyn Harper's injuries told a story of violence and betrayal, each detail confirming what she had tearfully recounted to detectives. Forensic specialists examined the scene thoroughly, collecting evidence that corroborated her account. The physical marks, the DNA analysis, and the signs of a struggle all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The assailant had been someone within the house, someone she trusted. From the lab, the results were damning. Forensic analysts identified Jamal's DNA in ways that confirmed his guilt beyond question. Coupled with his own partial confession, there was no ambiguity. But it wasn't just the evidence of the assault that painted a grim picture. It was the revelation of a deeper tragedy. As the investigation continued, Jamal admitted to being HIV positive, a fact he had concealed from everyone, including his grandmother. Medical professionals traced the virus back through Jamal's history of unprotected relationships. It was a timeline marked by recklessness, casual encounters, and a disregard for the potential consequences. Jamal's partners, many of whom were strangers, were now part of a wider investigation to ensure proper notification and care. The revelation added another layer of sorrow to the case. Evelyn, the victim of the assault, had also tested positive for HIV. Forensic analysis confirmed the heartbreaking connection. Her diagnosis was a direct result of Jamal's actions. This wasn't just a moment of physical violence. It was an act with repercussions that would alter Evelyn's life forever. With the evidence secured, the focus turned to understanding what could have driven Jamal to such extremes. His confession, while straightforward in some aspects, raised more questions than answers. Was this the result of years of substance abuse clouding his judgment? Or was there something deeper, a well of anger and grief that had festered unchecked? To those who knew Jamal, the transformation from a bright, spirited child to a man capable of such violence seemed incomprehensible. Some pointed to the devastating loss of his parents at a young age, a tragedy that had left him grappling with unresolved grief. Others noted his history of drug use and erratic behavior, suggesting that his descent into addiction had blurred his sense of morality. Detective James Carter offered his perspective during a press conference. When you look at Jamal's history, you see a pattern. Substance abuse, anger issues, a lack of direction. It's easy to blame those things, but the reality is, people face these challenges every day without crossing the lines he did. For members of the community, the case sparked fierce debate. Some argued that Evelyn had been too lenient, that her love and unwavering support had enabled Jamal's behavior to spiral out of control. Others took a more sympathetic view, believing that Jamal's life had been shaped by forces beyond his control, grief, trauma, and a sense of abandonment that no amount of love could fully repair. A neighbor who had known the family for years reflected on the tragedy. Evelyn did everything she could for him. She gave him a home, love, stability. But sometimes, no matter how much you give, it's not enough to fix what's broken inside. Despite the questions and debates, there was one undeniable fact. Jamal was the sole suspect in the crime. While his actions that night were influenced by years of poor decisions, no one else bore responsibility for the choices he made. The trial focused heavily on his past, with prosecutors painting a picture of a young man who had squandered the opportunities given to him. They detailed his history of substance abuse, his pattern of reckless relationships, and the escalating tension in his relationship with Evelyn. Each piece of evidence built the case that Jamal's actions were not a sudden lapse in judgment, but the culmination of years of unchecked behavior. Defense attorneys, on the other hand, attempted to shift the narrative. They argued that Jamal was a victim of circumstance, a boy who had lost everything at a formative age and had never been given the tools to process his grief. They pointed to his struggles with addiction and mental health as mitigating factors, suggesting that his actions were not born of malice but of desperation. But for many, these arguments rang hollow. The evidence was too clear, the consequences too severe. Jamal's past, while tragic, did not absolve him of the choices he made or the pain he inflicted. As the trial progressed, the community found itself divided. Some saw Jamal as a cautionary tale, a young man undone by grief and poor decisions. Others viewed him as a symbol of squandered potential, a reminder that even the strongest bonds of family can be tested and broken. For Evelyn, the trial was not about vengeance. It was about finding a way forward, about ensuring that Jamal faced the consequences of his actions while still holding on to the hope that he might one day find redemption. The truth of what happened that night was clear, but the questions it raised about love, accountability, and the weight of trauma remained unanswered. As the jury prepared to deliver their verdict, one thing was certain: the Harper family would never be the same, and the lessons of their tragedy would reverberate far beyond the walls of their home. The courtroom was silent as Jamal Harper stood before the judge, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Months of legal proceedings had come to an end, and the weight of what was to come seemed to press down on him. His plea of guilty to charges of assault, rape, and reckless endangerment marked the final chapter in a case that had devastated a family and shocked an entire community. For Jamal, the decision to plead guilty was a quiet acknowledgement of the harm he had caused, though it came far too late to undo the damage. The judge's voice was steady, yet firm, as the sentence was handed down: 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15. The words were final, a stark reminder of the gravity of his actions and the irreversible consequences they had wrought. Jamal's sentencing brought a mix of emotions to those who had followed the case closely. For many, it was justice served, a clear consequence for choices that had shattered a life and left deep scars on a family. But for others, there was no true sense of closure, only lingering questions about how a promising young life had taken such a dark turn. and whether anything could have been done to prevent it. Among those watching quietly from the gallery was Evelyn Harper, the woman at the center of this tragedy. Her face bore the lines of a life filled with love, loss, and sacrifice, but her expression that day was unreadable. She listened as the judge's words echoed through the room, her hands clasped tightly around a small silver cross she had brought with her, a symbol of the faith that had carried her through so much. For Evelyn, the outcome of the case was a bittersweet resolution. The grandson she had loved, nurtured, and prayed for was now a convicted felon, his life confined to the walls of a prison cell. And yet, despite the pain he had caused, her love for him remained. It was a love rooted not in denial or blind forgiveness, but in the unshakable belief that redemption was always possible, even in the face of unimaginable betrayal. Her health, already fragile before the events of that fateful night, had begun to decline further in the months that followed. The weight of her diagnosis, HIV, a cruel and lasting reminder of Jamal's actions, was compounded by the emotional strain of the trial. She moved more slowly now, her steps careful and deliberate, but her faith remained unbroken. In an interview given shortly after the sentencing, Evelyn spoke softly, her words tinged with both sadness and resilience. "I still pray for him every day," she said, her voice steady, that her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I pray that he finds his way, that he learns to make peace with what he's done, and becomes the man I know he can be. That's all I've ever wanted, for him to be whole." Her neighbors, who had watched her endure so much with quiet dignity, described her as a pillar of strength. "She's been through more than anyone should have to bear," one friend shared, "and yet she still finds it in her heart to forgive. That's who Big Mama is." The prosecutor, who had been the voice of justice throughout the trial, addressed the media following the sentencing. His tone was somber, his words carefully chosen. "This case highlights the devastating ripple effects of unchecked trauma and poor choices," he began. "Jamal Harper's actions were not just a crime against his grandmother, they were a betrayal of the love and sacrifice she had shown him throughout his life. This sentence serves as a reminder that actions have consequences, but it also underscores the importance of addressing the root causes of such tragedies." Detective James Carter, who had led the investigation, offered his own perspective. "In cases like this, there are no winners," he said. "Justice has been served, but the wounds left behind, both physical and emotional, will take a lifetime to heal. Our hope is that this outcome brings some measure of peace to Evelyn and reminds us all of the importance of recognizing and addressing the signs of trouble before it's too late." For the small community where Evelyn and Jamal once lived, the case served as a stark reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the devastating cost of unaddressed pain. Neighbors who had once seen Jamal as a bright, hopeful young boy now reflected on the missed opportunities to intervene, the moments where his path might have been redirected. But for Evelyn, the journey was not about looking back. Despite everything, she chose to focus on what lay ahead, on her faith, her recovery, and her hope that Jamal might one day find redemption. "I believe in second chances," she said quietly. "It's not for me to decide his fate. Only God can do that. But I hope that he uses this time to reflect, to heal, and to become the person he was meant to be." As she left the courthouse that day, supported by a friend on one side and her walking cane on the other, Evelyn carried with her the weight of both justice and love. The road ahead would not be easy, But she had already proven that her strength and faith could endure even the darkest of trials. The resolution of this case brings with it a sense of finality, but not closure. The Harper family's story is one of love tested, trust broken, and the enduring power of forgiveness. It is a reminder that while justice can address the actions of the past, the work of healing lies in the hands of those left to pick up the pieces. And for Evelyn, the journey of healing continues, one prayer at a time. This story is one of profound complexity, a tale of love, sacrifice, and ultimately, heartbreaking betrayal. At its core, it's about a bond so deep that even the most devastating acts couldn't sever it entirely. Evelyn Harper's unwavering devotion to her grandson Jamal serves as a testament to the strength of familiar love, even in the face of unimaginable pain. But this story is also a warning, a stark reminder of what happens when trauma is left unspoken, when grief festers unchecked, and when the weight of poor decisions leads to irreversible consequences. Evelyn was a woman of faith, a woman who believed in the power of prayer and redemption. But even her boundless patience and unconditional love were tested beyond measure. Her decision to hold Jamal accountable for his actions wasn't one of vengeance, but of necessity. A heartbreaking act of courage that no one should ever have to make. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility, forgiveness, and the delicate balance between love and justice. Could you forgive someone who hurt you as deeply as Jamal hurt Evelyn? Would you have made the same choice she did, turning in someone you love for the sake of accountability and, perhaps, their own salvation? These are not easy questions, but they are important ones, and they lie at the heart of this story. We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Evan's place? Do you believe in the power of redemption, even after such a betrayal? Or do you feel justice must always take precedence? Your perspectives matter, and this conversation is one that needs to continue, not just here, but in our homes, our communities, and our broader society. This story could not have been told without the efforts of many who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth and ensure that justice was served. We acknowledge the dedication of law enforcement, especially Detectives James Carter and Laura Martinez, who pursued this case with sensitivity and determination. We thank the medical professionals who provided critical evidence, the community members who offered their perspectives, and the advocacy groups that continue to raise awareness for victims of abuse and violence. If you or someone you know is struggling with trauma, addiction, or abuse, know that help is available. Resources exist to provide support, guidance, and a path toward healing. No one should have to face such challenges alone. Evelyn Harper's story is a painful reminder of the ripple effects of trauma, but also a call to action. It challenges us to look closer, to listen more carefully, and to address the signs of pain before they spiral out of control. Because in the end, it's not just about justice. It's about healing, and about ensuring that stories like this one never have to be told again. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it with others. Help spark conversations about love, accountability, and the importance of seeking help when it's needed most. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that challenge us to think deeply about the world around us. Together, we can continue the work of understanding, healing, and building a better future.